Hi, everyone. This is Alyssa Joel from the MBA Tour. For those of you who aren't familiar with what we do, we help business schools and prospective business school candidates meet, and we organize conferences around the world. We actually have a lot of conferences coming up July through October. So definitely check us out and see if we're coming to your city. I am joined by a colleague, Scott Edinburgh. He is founder of Personal MBA Coach, and he helps applicants, apply to business schools, and he really consults people on, the application process. So he's going to be presenting now, basically giving tips on how to manage your summer now that we are 4 months away until our one deadline. So I will let him take it from there. So thanks so much for attending, and Scott, take it away.
Thank you, Alyssa. Really appreciate it. Thank you for having me here. Welcome, everyone. Really appreciate you logging in this evening, this afternoon, this morning, depending on where you are. As Alyssa mentioned, we'll be talking about what to do before the round one deadlines. In case any of you are new to these webinars, there's a little chat feature on the right where you can type in questions, and there's a question feature. Feel free to use the chat and ask any questions that you have during the process, and make sure to answer them as we go. So a little bit about myself. I've been helping applicants globally get into business school since 2008. I began my career at MIT, where I studied economics and business at Sloan. And after studying at MIT, I started at Deloitte, worked in management consulting within strategy and operations for a few years, and went to Wharton for my MBA. I had previously studied economics in high school at Wharton during the summers, really liked the curriculum, wanted to go back for the MBA, so went there for the MBA, and been running Personal MBA Coach since then. I actually started this while I was a student at Wharton. So for the last 11 years, kind of here we are. I'll talk a little bit more about the company later on, but been recently ranked as the #4 consultant on Poets and Quants, #1 ranked on MBA Insights, and last year more than $4.5 million in scholarships were secured by our clients. So what do we do at Personal MBA Coach? This is a picture of me from an MBA tour in San Francisco. I believe that was this February with Alyssa and team. So we help applicants through all the stages of the application process, career advising before applications, and career advising once you're in school. I am on the board of directors of the Association of International Graduate Admissions Consultants, which is a group of admissions consultants, 7 of us globally, that work pretty closely with admissions directors throughout the year. We actually had a conference just last week with heads of admissions from all the top schools, and did a lot of things at the conference, including this mock application evaluation session where we sat in a room with admissions directors and analyzed applicant profiles and determined who should get accepted or rejected. So kind of fake applications, but just to get a sense for what happens as we're making decisions. At Personal MBA Coach, we have a team of former M7 interviewers from the M7 schools, and we help with interview prep. We also offer GMAT tutoring, and we have in-house software that we use to guide through the tutoring sessions. So that's a little bit about what we do. So round one, if any of you want to chime in on a chat, I'd love to hear how many of you are already sort of starting out in this process. And for those of you who don't feel like typing into the chat, that's fine. I'll just sort of chat through. Here's a little bit of a timeline. We always like to have timelines in our presentations, and this is a bit of a condensed one where we're going from May through September. So as you can see, there are a lot of things that you can start doing today if you want to plan to submit in September for round one. Obviously working on your personal story, we'll talk about that today. We'll talk about letters of recommendation, we'll talk through studying for the GMAT. Extracurriculars kind of happen throughout the process, so you should always be trying to develop your extracurriculars. and then certainly researching schools, starting to think through essays. It's funny, we have essay writing here starting in June, but actually we're already writing essays. Rather, clients are already writing essays. We're editing the essays with them for a lot of folks now. And then obviously submitting round one in September. One caveat here is if you're applying to Columbia Business School, of course, they have a rolling deadline. So often people are working a little bit earlier. So what to do in May? High level, first you can start to finalize your school lists. Think about what programs you want to target, schedule campus visits. You don't have to visit all the schools, but we'll talk a little bit about what you can do if you do visit schools. Finalizing plans to take or retake the test. If you want to think about taking the GMAT, or maybe you got a score that's, good, but perhaps not as high as you might otherwise like, then you can think about finalizing plans to retake. It's nice to take a test as early as you can. We do have applicants that take it all the way up to the deadline, but if you can get it done before you do essays, that's great. Probably half of our clients at this point have a GMAT score, and half of them are still, let's say, working on tutoring with us or self-studying to try to get that score. And then obviously developing your resume. So these are a few things you can do in May. First of all, developing a well-rounded school list. Overall, applicants apply to 5 or more schools on average. 5 is the most common number that we see, 6 is the second most common, and 4 is the third most common. I also delivered the results of this AGAC survey to all the admissions directors I mentioned before last week, and that was a survey done of over 1,000 applicants, and that number came back at 4.5 for the average number of schools. So people are applying to a good number of schools. Now, the right number really depends on you and your background, your risk tolerance. We have people applying to 2 schools. We have people applying to 10 schools. So it really does, sort of depend on the background, let's say. You want to include a range of, difficulty here. Now, what is this right range? It really depends on the person, again, and your risk tolerance. But ideally, we have some target schools. Push yourself. If you feel like, your test score is a little bit below the average, but you think that your extracurriculars are strong and your work experience is strong, don't be afraid to push yourself and apply to some reach schools. And at the same time, it's nice to have some safety schools. You should be realistic. Many clients come and they say, I just want to do Harvard and Stanford. Maybe I'll look at the test score. Perhaps we have a lower test score, fewer years of work experience. It might be good to level out the sort of strategy and apply to some schools that are, perhaps a bit easier to get into as well. And also, as you develop your school list, pay attention to culture and fit. Now, you might be saying, why am I logging in to have Scott tell me I need to pay attention to culture? Well, it's not just for you. I mean, yes, for you, you should be applying to schools that you feel like are a good fit and that you would really enjoy the time there, but it's also just as much for the school. One of the things that we talked about last week at the AGAC conference with admissions directors is the importance of fit and the importance of cultural fit. So it's pretty crucial for you to demonstrate your knowledge of the program to schools and for you to show them that you will be a good fit in the program. Now, some schools are more interested in this cultural fit than others, but by and large, it is pretty important. So you want to do research. You want to figure out which schools are, right for you based on learning method, class culture, perhaps types of clubs they have, interaction with students and faculty, or perhaps lack thereof. So visiting campuses. One question I get is, do I need to visit? How often should I visit? How far do I have to travel? So from a timing perspective, now is always the good time to visit. Given we are in the middle of May, a lot of the formal visits with classes are over because MBA students are mostly done with class at this point, with some exceptions, of course, for some schools. That said, you can still certainly visit the programs and get a sense for the community, perhaps do tours, see the campus, and then you could always go back in the fall to see a class if you want. If you live near a school, you want to visit. So if you're in New York and you're applying to NYU or Columbia and you haven't visited, you need to visit. If you're in Boston, you're going to MIT or Harvard, definitely visit, and you can fill in the blanks for any other cities that you're in. Also, if cities are nearby, I like to say within a few hours or so you should visit. But I know we have people logging in from Hong Kong. We have people logging in from India. I think there's one or two from Australia. If you live abroad and you're applying to schools in the US, you don't need to visit. Similarly, if you're in Chicago and you're applying to INSEAD or London Business School, you also don't need to visit. And it's not expected for you to get a plane ticket and take a few days off from work to visit. But if you're not visiting a school, you should be interacting with them. Obviously, the MBA tour is a great place to visit schools. I will be traveling with the MBA tour throughout North America and probably some global destinations this summer, and I'll be giving a different presentation than this, but I'll be giving a talk. I'll be traveling with admissions directors. These are good ways to engage with admissions folks if you're not able to visit their schools. Also, pay attention to online webinars. Obviously, you're logged into this webinar, so you enjoy webinars to some extent. Schools also have webinars where they'll tell you things about the program, and they do track things. So they are able to see who logged into the webinar, how many webinars did you log into. I believe data is also there in terms of when you sign in and when you leave. I'm not sure how much it's actually viewed, but your activity is tracked, let's say. And then try to visit classes if you can. Now, if you are visiting in the fall and you're applying in round 2, you have plenty of time. If you're applying in round 1 and you want to visit in the fall, you can still visit. It might be after you submit the application, but it still gives you content for perhaps some interviews. Schedule conversations and meetings ahead of time. So what I mean by this is if you are planning to visit a campus and you perhaps want to meet with a student, don't just show up on campus and say, okay, let's sit down and meet with folks. Schedule this ahead of time and make sure to plan, especially if you're interested in a particular club or student group. Think of who might be on campus, and if it's in the summer, you might want to talk with a faculty member perhaps. Scheduling things in advance can make sure that folks are there. And it's also really good to do this, again, not just for you. It's always good for you to learn, but schools do track the interaction that you have with folks that are associated with admissions and just with students and professors in general. So for those of you who just joined, thanks for joining. I'll go over a bit about myself and my company background, Personal MBA Coach, towards the end. Feel free to ask questions. There's a questions section and there's a chat feature. The questions are always really rich here, so feel free to ask questions in the questions section, and we will be talking about that. I'll go to a first question now. Planning to take the GMAT ASAP. Fantastic. I like it. Very good. This is more of a comment than a question, but I really appreciate the enthusiasm. So, talking about GMAT. The GMAT is a fun test. I know some of you might think it's not so fun, but what's fun about it is you get multiple chances here. There are entrance exams for other graduate programs besides business school where you don't have as many chances. Here at the GMAT, you have chances. So you can take it 5 times in a year. Scores last for 5 years, and you can take it no more than 8 times. My guess is a lot of you already know this, but the reason I put this up is because it's important to think about this ahead of time. I do have some people that come to us every year who, unfortunately kind of already took the test 4 times before they come. Maybe they take it 1 more time, and then they're kind of locked up for the rest of the year. So you do want to plan your test wisely so that you make sure not to sort of use up your test too early. I like to say, unless you're getting 20 points above, the ideal score that you want to get, you might not be ready to take the test. And schools do look at the number of times that you've taken a test. If you cancel a test, it is wiped from the record, but some programs still ask you how many times you've taken the test. And if you tell them, it's better to have a lower number. That said, you do want to think about what low means. So taking it 3 or 4 times is totally fine. If you're taking it, 7 or 8 times, might be called into question, whether you should have taken it that many times. So retake it, but once you get to a certain number, let's try to make sure that we're going to perform well before the next test. So start GMAT prep as early as you can. It's nice to, take some practice tests. to get a baseline score. MBA.com has sample tests. Those are the best ones to use. When we offer tutoring, we have in-house software that we use to guide through the tutoring sessions. We have 5 tutors on our team who have 790 plus on the GMAT, 3.95 or more GPAs from top Ivy League schools. So we can certainly help you here. And we have our own sets of practice tests as well. But really what you want to do is think about the model that works for you. One-on-one tutoring is great. Perhaps you're a self-studier. If you are, you might want to think about how much time you need to prepare. And I would also say read articles. This might seem weird. Why is Scott telling me to read articles? But it helps to increase your vocabulary and make you more familiar with just reading comprehension in general. So these are a few things that you can do to get your kind of testing underway. The resume. You all have a resume, and for the most part, the resume would need to be changed for business schools. So I haven't seen a professional resume that doesn't need to be changed. You really want to customize this. What this means is highlight accomplishments, highlight how you did things and what the results were. Try to make sure that you're not just typing your job description. The other thing that you want to think about is having very specific results, and the results should be measurable. What does this mean? So if you saved money, if you saved time, if you increased something by 3%, introduced a new initiative that formerly wasn't offered at the company. These are all measurable results, let's say. When thinking about what to write in the resume, it's important to focus on skills that are general and transferable. What I mean by this is if you're in a very specific industry, we have folks across industries. We have people that work in consulting, finance, perhaps working on an oil rig in oil and gas, right? We don't want to think about something that's really specific to the industry. If you're doing something upstream or downstream, right? Consider that the reader who is looking at the resume may or may not be an expert in what you're doing. And even if they are an expert, they want to see what you've learned that can really help you in more of a general MBA setting. So things like analyzing things, looking at strategy, researching, right? These are all important things to focus on. Also, note really important experiences outside of work. So, hobbies, passions, right? Things that are of high quality. I see a question on the resume, so I'll answer this now. So let's see, do schools prefer 1-page resumes or can they extend to 2 pages? Great question. If you are applying to a full-time MBA program, then a 1-page resume is preferred. It's strongly preferred. I just saw someone who signed up with us for one of our 6 school packages. He applied last year on his own to not get in. The first thing that I said was the resume is too long. It was a 2-page resume and he was going for full-time programs. 1 page is very, very strict for most, if not all, full-time programs. But if you're applying for an executive MBA, then 2 pages is perfectly fine. If you're going for a full-time program, then they assume that you can fit everything of quality onto 1 page. Great question. Any other questions on resumes before we go on? Feel free to type any other questions here. What about part-time programs? I thought that might be the question. So for part-time programs, I usually prefer a 1-page resume, but it depends how much experience you have. So if you're applying to a part-time program and you have more than 10 years of experience, then going on to 2 pages might be acceptable. Really, the question to ask yourself is, why do you need more space? I have people with 16 years of experience that fit everything on 1 page. I have a 1-page resume and I have a lot of experience. So I think you really want to ask yourself, what is going on this resume and are you able to kind of condense it? Is there any pattern for a resume? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by pattern for a resume, but I can talk a little bit about like structure. So it's good to start with obviously contact information on top. Then you want to go in and write about the professional experience. For the most part, professional experience should cover about 60%, 65% or so of the resume. Then you can talk about extra curriculars, education, and interest down at the bottom. So that's kind of a structure, if that's what you meant by pattern. Next question, how would we put hobbies and passions on the resume? Yeah, so I would say those are two different things. Hobbies, I'm assuming that might include like an extracurricular, perhaps a leadership role. So if I'm interested in helping other people with music, perhaps I'm a music tutor, or maybe I'm on the board of a particular music association. That would go under extracurricular or leadership, which comes down towards the bottom of the resume, most likely the second to bottom listing. Passions would really be more like an interest, so if I'm interested in traveling or scuba diving, I like to have one line on the bottom of the resume that just has interest, and then you're listing them. You're not really writing a lot of detail about them. You're more so just, putting them down as a conversation starter. So when I was applying to schools, I had visited 35 countries on my resume. Sometimes an interviewer would say, oh, wow, that's a lot of countries. Which countries have you visited? And I have to start to think back to which countries. Just a nice conversation starter. So here's a question. If you're submitting for round one with only 2 years of work experience, does that put you at a disadvantage? Most schools suggest 3 to 5 years experience, but I'm not sure if 3 starts when you apply or when you are accepted. Great question. So the years of experience that you see are always years upon matriculation. So if you have 2 years of experience now, then you would have 3 years upon matriculation. You're definitely in range. I would want to know more about your background to see whether it's too early or perhaps at the right time. We help applicants with 3 years of experience matriculate. We sent some applicants that we actually met at the MBA tour who started with 2 years of experience. So there definitely is a range, but I would want to look in more detail. And if you have any specific questions or you want more feedback on the profile, feel free to send me an email. Scott, S-C-O-T-T, @personalmbacoach.com, or you can go to www.personalmbacoach.com and request a consultation, and we can talk about this and talk about how we can help. But yes, years of experience are considered upon matriculation. So, and then this might not have a specific answer, but in your opinion, is there a certain number of years of experience business schools like seeing on a resume? Okay, so that's good. We really want to, if for the resume specifically, we want to see all of your experience. So everything that you've done after undergraduate should go on the resume. And I just talked about the range. The median years of experience is 5 upon matriculation for most schools. This does vary by school to some extent. But, we see a range. Again, we send people with just a couple years of experience, and we have folks with, 8 or 9 years of experience, let's say. Okay, great. So we'll move on to June. So now what are we doing in June? June to-do list, right? Develop a personal story if you haven't already done this. Articulate your goals. Nail down your recommenders. It's never too early to confirm recommenders, but that said, you want to think about how this might impact your, let's say, experience and performance at work. If your boss is not really a strong proponent of business schools, then you might want to wait a little bit longer before asking them, or perhaps not asking them at all. That said, June is a great time to nail down your recommenders. You always want to get these letters as soon as you can. People get busy during the summer, and they might not want to, stop for a few weeks and, let's say, write a rec letter. So the earlier the better. And then certainly drafting your essays. So we are already working on essay editing with clients. It's not too early to start. A lot of schools have released their questions at this point, or rather, some schools have released their questions. A lot of schools are not likely to change their questions. And perhaps from conversations, we might hear about what might be likely to change, what might not be likely to change, and you can look at patterns over the years to see that. So, personal story. Developing your personal story should start with some reflection. Ask yourself, what are you really about? What drives you here? What are your passions? Think about how you are unique from your peers. we could talk for 2 hours about personal story. So we'll just talk for a few minutes here, but you really want to think about what choices you've made. Chicago Booth is one school that actually asks about the reasons why you've made choices in your life, and that's really a proxy for seeing how thoughtful you are in this process. And what are some circumstances that might have shaped you? So everyone has a unique personal story. If we were doing this live, I would ask you all to vote. I guess next time we can set up a poll in the system, but take a look at these two profiles and look at this for a minute while I start to read some of the questions. Think about which profile is better. You don't have to vote. You can do this in some silent voting, let's say, but just think about which one you think is better. Skip too fast. In this case, Michael actually has a better story, a more unique personal story. The reasons for this, obviously GPA is lower and GMAT is lower, so doesn't necessarily have higher stats, but everything kind of combines together. We have interest in competitive swimming, we teach underprivileged how to swim, and we mentor teens. We're doing some work on technology, and then in the short term, we want to build product management, and long term, run product management at a technology firm. Everything just sort of connects together better. The first person is interested in music, works for Junior Achievement, which is a nonprofit, and then we want to talk about tech work and the startup, and then starting a company in digital media down the line. But the client experience has really just been across sectors. So a lot of work around healthcare, maybe some retail. Things didn't really connect quite as well. So we want to think about how well the story connects. This doesn't mean that you cannot have multiple parts of you in the story. You can certainly have different parts of you in your story. The personal story can be different from the professional story, but you really want things to kind of connect as best they can. So I see a bunch of questions. Let's start to answer some of them. Some who didn't take a GMAT yet, when would it be safe to take it by? Well, I'll tell you, I took the GMAT on June 11th, and I think that was a little bit late in the process. That said, it depends when you want to apply. We have people who take the test in the last few days before applying. I would say as long as you leave yourself at least a month or two before the deadlines, that's pretty safe. That said, we have a lot of people doing things simultaneously. So I would say about half of our clients now that we're working with for round one have not taken the test. And ideally they're taking it, it's mid-May, over the next couple months or so, let's say. Part of this also depends on how much free time you have and whether you want to study for the GMAT while doing the applications. Next question, some schools don't specify reference preferences, academic or professional. Is professional general? Yes, you do not want to get an academic reference unless a school specifies. MIT Sloan has an LGO program, and if you're applying through LGO, which is a dual degree, they do want a reference letter, more of a technical reference letter, and often that comes from an academic, so from a professor. Unless a school asks you for a professor, do not ask professors from undergraduate. You're applying to business school, they want to see how you've worked and what people would say about you from a professional standpoint. So, got a specific question. I'll try to answer this, but you might want to reach out to me separately. How do I choose my recommenders? I have varied background, worked as a VP in mining, now I'm in tech, but not in a high role. I've also worked in a couple of countries. This is a little bit more specific, so I am going to table this and ask you to reach out to me separately because it really does depend, and I would want to dive into your profile in a bit more detail. But we will talk about recommenders in a minute. So let me actually get to recommenders, and then I'll answer the rest of the questions. Start to think about your letter of recommendation strategy in detail. We put this bullet here. You don't have to ask the partner or the CEO. And in other presentations, I've had pictures of CEOs on the side. This is not a CEO on the right. This is just someone who's typing on a laptop. What I mean by that is ask someone who will just write a very, very good letter. You don't need to worry about prestige. What you want to make sure is that they've worked with you for a long time. And what a long time means is at least 6 months, ideally a couple of years. So the reason you don't need to ask a partner or the CEO of the company is because you want someone who can write really specific details about you. And you want to start doing things that you want written about in the letter now. Imagine you can sit down over coffee and tell the recommender things that you want included in the letter and key accomplishments that you've had at work. Well, that's perfectly fine to do. And it would be great to sit down over coffee and talk about some high level things that would be good to include in the recommendation, but you have to actually do these things. So maybe you are a consultant and you're doing a lot of analytical work, but perhaps not a lot of modeling, maybe not a lot of presentations. So maybe you can start to do that. Ask for some opportunities to present to different clients in different settings. You want to think about non-professional references if you have strong extracurriculars. I would say about 10% of our clients ask someone from outside of the main job. It's not that common, but it's good if you're doing similar things at work to what everyone else is doing, and you feel like you might not have the most exciting job, or perhaps you're tested in one way but not tested in another, and you're doing this extracurricular where you're managing a team of 30 people, you're managing volunteers, you're marketing to large groups, and maybe that's different than what you're doing at work on a day-to-day basis. So in that case, it's nice to ask for a extracurricular reference. Ask your references early. You know, it's not too early to ask now, but I would say June is a comfortable time to ask. Definitely by early July. Otherwise, it just gets a little bit late and people travel, and you don't want to, you know, force them to rush through this process. Last bullet here is using additional influential or alumni notes when it makes sense. So this is not a direction to go out and ask all the alumni you know to write a reference letter on your behalf. But if you do have one or two key people in your life who can write a casual letter on your behalf to admissions, it's nice to do. But this is not a formal letter. This is more like an email to admissions. For some schools, you can fill out a form, or rather they can fill out a form online. So I get some questions here. Some people to whom we may request a letter of recommendation are just too busy for this task. Yes, I hear you. And I thought about writing the letter for them to sign. How much would you recommend this? So I would not recommend doing this. It's interesting because I actually gave this data point in the AGAC survey that I talked about to admissions directors for the percentage of people who are being asked to write recommendation letters. And we started asking years ago, and now we're asking this again this year. So the numbers went down from mid 60% who are asked to write their own recommendation letter, now down to about 24%. In the US, it's down to 15%, and it does vary based on industry. The reason I would not recommend doing this, well, there are a lot of reasons. One is it's not what you should be doing in this process. Two is that even if you're not interested in what you should or shouldn't be doing, schools can figure out if you wrote your own recommendation letter. And then the third reason, and perhaps the most important, is often I see that recommendations that a recommender writes actually turn out to be stronger than one that you might create on your own. If someone is busy, and I totally hear you, some people are just too busy for this. First of all, try to remind them of what they need to do. A lot of schools are asking for the common recommendation letter, so they don't have to write individual letters for each school. And if you give them some talking points and bullet points, it might be enough for them to write the letter. If they really are too busy, then you might want to think about other folks in your network who can get involved and help them. Sometimes a couple people at a company would get together and think together about what things that you've done that have been impressive, and then one person drafts it. But it's definitely good to have someone else write the letter and not you. However, it is a common question. Okay. Can you use the same professional reference for more than one school? Absolutely. Great question. I usually recommend having the same two people write your recommendation letters for all schools. It makes your life a lot easier. and you probably have people that like you to different extents, and so may as well ask the people who like you the most to write the recommendation letter. So you can certainly have people write the same letter of recommendation across schools. Okay, so what makes a good recommendation letter? Specificity, recency, honesty, and detail. You don't need to read all these bullet points, but basically you want the recommender to compare you to other people. You want the reader to be able to, see how you do work, see your teamwork, how have you grown in the past. Make sure the examples are provided here. So the more specific, the better here. Recency, you want to make sure that your current abilities are reflected. That's the main reason for getting a recent letter of recommendation. It's not that admissions directors are not sure if you're performing well here or performing well there. It's that they really want to see that your current abilities are shown here, especially if you only have a few years of experience. Because if you ask an old recommender, they might just not be able to talk about things you're doing now as much. So recency is important. What this means is ideally someone within the last couple of years or so, or a few years. Now this varies by school. I actually learned a lot last week in our AGAT conference, a bit about preferences by school, let's say, but by and large, you want to think about people that can talk about your recent performance. Now, if you have two jobs and maybe you're 4 years out and you were doing banking for 2 years and private equity for 2 years, I talked to someone new today who's in this situation. It's perfectly fine to ask someone from your PE firm and then someone from the bank that you worked at for the first 2 years. But if you are 6 years out of school and you spent the first 2 years at a job and the last 4 years at another job, you might want to just get the two letters from the most recent job where you've worked at for the last 4 years. I'm not sure that the details that the recommender would cover in the work experience of the first 2 years is really worth going back that old. That said, this really does depend person by person. One of the things that we do with clients is we have an hour-long brainstorming session at the beginning where we're talking about passions, hobbies, challenges, struggles, really going over the entire story. Part of that is talking about the recommender strategy. So it is not always the easiest question to answer. Honesty. So you want these recommendations to be really, really honest. I can't stress this enough. I had a conversation with a couple admissions directors from top schools last week that essentially said that, if everything is too positive, if your recommendations are too strong, if your essays are too strong, if everything is just so amazing, it's not clear to them why you need to go to that school to begin with. So it's okay that there's feedback. Feedback should actually be feedback. We should be telling schools what you need to improve upon. And maybe you've started to improve upon these things now, but we don't want the letters to come across as, Billy is the best person ever, and he's so amazing, he's better than everyone. Then why are you going to business school to begin with? So believable letters are important. That said, the bar is high. So it is a careful balance to find, let's say, because you don't want to just be an average person doing the work, needing to improve upon a ton of things, because then why are they taking you over maybe everyone else who's applying? Make sure that the recommenders answer the questions. I can't stress this enough. I hear stories where recommenders are writing letters and maybe they're not answering the questions that they should be answering. So show the recommenders what the questions are. Most of these questions are made public to applicants for most schools. So it's a good idea to send the questions to them ahead of time and say, hey, this is what they're asking. They want 250 words on this. They want 300 words on that. Make sure to show them ahead of time what they need to be writing. And length is also important. So if you have a rec letter that asks for 1,000 words and you copy a letter, your recommenders rather copy a letter that is only 300 words just because it's easier, that might not help you as much. So again, go over the length for the recommender so that once you set them free and ask them to write the letters, they know what they need to be doing. Okay, so have some questions. Can the recommendation letter be the same for all schools, or should it be tailored for the school? Great question. So for the most part, the recommendation letter can be the same. It is nice, and first of all, schools that ask for a common letter of recommendation, and there are a lot of schools that ask for this, then that's the exact same letter. They write one letter, they upload it to the system, and it gets sent across, or they copy and paste it to all the schools, but it is a common letter. If the recommendation questions are similar, but not exactly the same, then it's nice to customize maybe a couple lines or so. So if a recommender mentions why you want to go to Yale SOM, why you want to go to Columbia Business School, it's nice to show those schools that there's an interest in the school enough that the recommender took the time to talk about why it's the right program for them. They will assume that the recommendation is similar across schools, so it's fine that it's not totally unique, but it's nice for them to write some specific details. Some essay guiding principles, right? These are some things to think about. Answer the question that's asked, write authentically, ensure that essays really fit with your personal story, be succinct, right? Don't repeat yourself necessarily. It doesn't mean that everything has to be totally unique, but try to pick unique topics when you can, and keep your language approachable. What I mean by approachable is you want to think about something that's industry specific and perhaps not industry specific. Try to talk about things that are not so industry specific. Essays are very time consuming. These are some things that you can be doing over time. Brainstorming, outlining, drafting essays. Right, now's the time when you want to be drafting. Editing. So edit again and again. We edit client essays anywhere from 3 to 7 times per essay. There were some HBS students who actually wrote 11 versions of an essay. There's no magic number, but you really want to make sure to edit these essays again and again and have them proofread. So it's always good to have someone who's not familiar with your content, if you're not working with a consultant, to make sure to review the essays. July, what do we do in July? Edit, right? You want to be editing your essays a lot, networking with alumni and current students. So you want to be, putting finishing touches on the essays and, ensuring that the content that you have is strong and that your story is coherent, let's say. Again, ask someone else to read your essays who is not familiar with the work that you do. What this means is someone who's ideally not in business. I like to say, perhaps ask a physician to to edit your essays and review them, and make sure that at least they review it and that it seems like it's easy for them to understand. Also, make sure that your friend reviews an essay and tells you that it's authentic. Authenticity is really important. I talked to someone today on the phone who, I really appreciate it. I had a great conversation, but the first piece of feedback that I'm going to give them once we start working together is to not be so polished. Sometimes you can be too polished and too sort of mechanic. You want things to be flowing naturally, and that can, that can be understood in your essays. It can definitely be understood as you're doing any kind of interviews. Okay, networking. So networking is important, and oops, a little bit too much here. So networking is important, and it's a great way to learn about programs, develop essay material, and confirm your interest in the schools. So things to think about when networking: look at who's in your office, look at who's in your undergrad alumni network. Think about family and friends, personal connection. Ask a lot of experience about these folks and what they've done. People like to talk, and especially if you find someone who you're talking with who's in your network and they're helping you, will certainly like to talk, but make sure not to ask for favors right away. So if you have someone who perhaps is a graduate of Columbia Business School or Wharton or UCLA, and you want to apply there and you said, oh, they would be a great person to write a recommendation letter for me, don't ask them right away. Start to facilitate the relationship, sort of get them bought into your plan. And to some extent, less is more. If you have a few quality people who like you, and maybe one person who will write an informal recommendation letter or call up someone that they know, that's a lot more beneficial than having 7 or 8 people that you talk to, none of whom really do much of anything for you. August, what happens in August? Short answer questions, if you haven't already done those. A lot of these schools have long short answer questions. Harvard and Stanford tend to have the longest, but London Business School also has, and INSEAD actually also has a lot of short questions that you have to fill out. So fill out the short answer questions. Don't leave this until the end. Proofread. Make sure that everything is proofread, and ensure your letters of recommendation are all set. Remind your recommenders, and remind them again, and remind them again. And when everything is finished, get them a nice gift to say thank you. You want to save time for last-minute items, right? They will take longer than you may think, unless you've already gone through this process or you've looked at all the short answer questions and you thought about this, right? Make sure that the short answers really complement the rest of your application. Check in with your recommenders and ask how you can help. It's fine to share your essays with your recommenders. It's actually nice because this shows them what you're writing about. And as they write their recommendations, they can think about what they write and try to make sure that what they write is really kind of complementing the rest of the application. Okay, and then ask someone who's not familiar with your material to do a thorough proofread. Our clients last year not only got into schools, but received a lot of scholarships, $4.5 million last year. So we get many times more than the average as far as scholarship dollars. A little bit about what we do. I noticed some of you joined later. So Personal MBA Coach is a boutique admissions consulting and tutoring firm. We offer GMAT and GRE tutoring. We help with essay brainstorming, content brainstorming, personal story development. We do a lot of editing, so resume editing, essay editing. We can help with school selection. A lot of what we can do is not only work on the documents with you, but also help you to think about what schools you should be researching, how to interact with schools, which students to talk to, things like that. And then we do unlimited edits of the essays. And we have graduate English professors on our team who also are a second set of eyes on the essays as we go. We give guidance on letters of recommendation, and we have a team of more than 12 former interviewers to conduct mock interviews. So this is a little bit of a guide that you can download if you want. It's called MBA Planning Kickstart. We have a lot of guides that we publish online. So feel free to frequent our website, and you can sign up for our mailing list if you're not already on there, and we can send you more guides. But this one tells you a lot of things to be thinking about as you're planning. So if there are any other questions, feel free to type them. We have a bunch of questions here that we didn't get a chance to answer, so I'll spend some time answering them. And then feel free to ask any other questions as well. And if you want to talk privately, again, sign up on our website, personalmbacoach.com, and you can request a consultation. And personally, I'll jump on the phone and chat with you about your situation and how we might be able to help. So here's a question. I have 9 years of work experience and a great professional growth trajectory, but my GPA is not good. How will this impact me and my application? So I would say that if the GPA is not strong, there are ways that you can offset that. You can take extra graduate level courses, and feel free to ask me what some places are that you can take them. But for instance, Berkeley Extension has great courses that you can take online. Harvard Business School online is another way that you can show that you can do well in an academic setting. You can also obviously do well in the GMAT. I do not believe that a low GPA will keep you out of any school necessarily, but it might make it a lot harder for you to get in. So I would really have to look at everything in total to determine whether that's going to keep you out. The other thing is the structure of program. If you have 9 years of work experience now and you would matriculate with 10, what is the right program for you? That would put you on the older end of things, or rather on the more experienced range for full-time MBA programs. So you might be considering part-time or an executive MBA. Okay, do alumni, current student referrals or recommendations help in addition to professional recommendations? Yes, they do. Now, again, this doesn't mean that you should go out and ask 12 alums to write letters on your behalf, but if you have 1, maybe 2 people who know you well and will strongly refer you to the school, that can help supplement the professional recommendations and show schools another side of you. What are some examples of short answer questions? Great question. So short answer questions can include descriptions of your career. They might include something like, what has been your most significant accomplishment? How have you grown in the past? Things like that. They tend to be anywhere from 200 characters up to 100 or 150 words, let's say, and they would be embedded in the application itself. Some schools actually have a quote short answer question that is kind of like a mini essay where you talk about your experiences and maybe talk about what your goals are. And so you really want to read through the whole application because it might not be published as a quote essay. What is my advice for someone who doesn't have clarity on the specialization they want to study in business school? So you really don't need to know for sure what you want to study in school. My advice would be to take stock of you and your interests. Think about what brought you to this webinar here to begin with, right? What are you looking to do going forward in your career? What do you enjoy now? What you want to be doing differently in the future? And then think through what might help you to get there. You actually don't really need to have a specialization at the beginning. You don't even need to have a specialization ever for some schools. There are some schools that don't require you to have a major. Many schools have a major that's optional. And so you just want to think about what things are important. Are you looking at developing more analytical skills? Are you looking at perhaps improving your public speaking? I took a lot of public speaking classes at Wharton when I studied for my MBA, and that helps me do things like this webinar and other presentations that I give. So think about what's really important to you and what you want to develop. Can I talk more about fellowships that are offered to some high qualified candidates at Wharton? So there are different merit-based fellowships that are offered by a lot of leading schools. Wharton is certainly one of them. The fellowships are offered based on a number of different factors to different groups of people. It is kind of hard to go into great detail on a short call like this, but what I can say is if you want to increase the chances of getting a fellowship, you want to have really strong essays. So a lot of our clients do get a lot of merit money for having strong essays, and you want to have a high GMAT score as well. Those are the two things that lead to those. Apologies, I didn't really answer that question, but it would be kind of a long answer, so feel free to reach out if you have further questions. Does the alumni recommendation go along with your official application? Yeah, it is a little bit more informal for most schools, so it doesn't go with your application. The other thing is you do not need to get this. I want to be clear because otherwise everyone's going to get lots of letters, and honestly, it can hurt you if you get too many or if you get letters that really aren't supportive. But if you do have someone who is kind of vouching for you separately from the application, sometimes it's an email to admissions, sometimes it is through the back end. A student might be able to kind of refer you internally. It does vary based on the school, but it would not be a formal letter of recommendation. It would not go with your application formally through the site. When do you apply for scholarships? Most schools don't require you to apply for fellowship money or scholarship money. They just award it based on the merit of the application. So we do grade applications. They come back to you and say, here's $50,000, here's $100,000. There are some schools that do have a separate application, but the number is very small, and that would happen after you apply to school. And for many schools, it's actually after you get in as well. So you can worry about that later. Like Berkeley has a separate essay that you have to write if you want merit money, and they ask you for that after you've been accepted. You're most welcome. Thank you for joining. Any other questions from anyone? These can be questions on really anything. Sometimes people ask about school selection or perhaps interview prep or really, anything like that. I'm happy to answer anything that's on your mind. We have a few more minutes here. I'll answer a question that I got earlier today. It wasn't from anyone on the line here, but I got this question earlier today from a client. It was around applying in round 1 versus round 2. What's that strategy? Depending on the school, often round 1 is going to be a bit better than round 2. The seats are all empty if they haven't accepted anyone. So especially if you come from a certain group where they might not accept a lot of people, maybe it's more of a niche job, something like that. It's always nice to apply earlier. Some schools are much more receptive to round 1 than round 2. And some schools it's not that much of a difference. But then there's the question of what are you going to do if you apply to round 1 schools? Maybe you don't apply to as many, you don't get in, then you can apply to round 2. Well, if you think about the timing, assuming you get interviews at schools in round one, by the time you hear the results, whether you will get in post-interview, it's probably early or mid-December. And at that point, it's kind of late to start a new round two application. So what happens in practice is more people are doing more schools in round one for that reason. Now, it is feasible to apply to round two schools anyway in that short period of time, but not really recommended. And it's feasible if you don't get any interviews. Say if you apply to schools that are way outside of your range just to see what happens, they don't invite you to interview, then you'll probably find out earlier on in the fall and you'll be able to add some round two schools to the list. Will we send a PDF and recording by email? Yes, so do you have your information, and we will be following up with a PDF of this and a place for you to find the recording online. What are key factors when I say fit with the school? That's a really good question. And I can see from your perspective, you might be wondering, what is this guy talking about fit? So there are different dimensions of fit. One dimension is personal interests, let's say. So certain schools have students that are interested in certain things. Let's say social impact is really important. If you've done a lot of work in social impact, the fit might be there. Some schools really prioritize teamwork over others. Now, all schools talk about teamwork, but some schools, really have teamwork sort of embedded in the fabric of the culture in the school. And perhaps if you've done a lot of work in teams, then that might be a good fit. There are also schools that are really interested in international exposure, perhaps language exposure. If you've really been exposed to language or you've traveled internationally quite a bit, that might be a good fit. Some schools are more analytical than others, and perhaps having experience in an analytical field might help you kind of fit into that school. These are just a few examples. There are a lot of different things that can mean that you are going to be a good fit with the school. And so it's definitely good to do your research. However, that said, in theory, people are good fits for many schools, right? If you're applying to 5 or 6 schools, there's obviously more than one school that you could, fit in well with. And so it's important to demonstrate that you could be a good fit for that program, not necessarily that that's the only program for you. I don't recommend only applying to one school because this process is challenging and random. Even if you're working with a consultant and we're submitting great applications, right? We're applying to 5 or 6 schools usually. So you do want to show that you can be a good fit for multiple schools. In terms of developing one's application, do you think it's more important to focus on studying to obtain higher scores or spending one's time on an interesting extracurricular opportunity? I would have to look at the whole profile before giving you that answer. So I'd love to take a look at your resume, but I would say if the options are to have a much higher test score or to have an interesting extracurricular, I'd probably pick the higher test score. That said, I'd love to have both, which I know sort of cheating to say that. I'd love to have both because we really want a well-rounded profile. But depending on what that extracurricular is, if it's such an amazing opportunity that it's better to do that than to have a good test score, it's possible, but I would say that's probably not that common. It is a little bit more common to instead sort of prefer a higher test score than to have a little bit better of an extracurricular. But of course, better to do both. I don't feel like my extracurriculars are strong. Any advice for what I can do to beef that up during the summer? So you can definitely do things to improve extracurriculars, but I wouldn't be able to give you advice now on this webinar without really knowing a lot about you. It is something that we do consult applicants on a case-by-case basis to help them to develop a better extracurricular profile and suggest certain things that they can be doing to beef that up. But it really is kind of dependent on the applicant. So it would be hard to give advice for you without knowing about your background. But feel free to reach out and schedule time to connect if you'd like. I'd be more than happy to help. The webinar might automatically shut off in about a minute. And since we are here at the end, I want to say thank you everyone for joining. Really appreciate the time here. Appreciate the great questions. And for those people who I was not able to answer the questions during this time, please feel free to reach out again separately. And also look for future MBA Tour events and future MBA Tour webinars. I'll be joining some more of these later on in the summer. Can you still hear me now? I think we stopped recording, but I believe we're still, yes, you can still, okay, perfect. Yeah, so one common problem that applicants have is figuring out how to really clearly define their goals and communicate them in a well thought out way. I often have applicants come to me and they know they want to do something, maybe it's in finance or maybe it's in marketing, but it's just not really clearly defined and it isn't, let's say, presented in a way that allows admissions to know what they've done before and clearly what they want to do at the school and what they want to do going forward. So that clarity is super important. The other thing that's tricky for some people is honestly managing the different parts of the process. One of the things that we do, which I don't think is the biggest value add, but it's certainly a value add, is helping applicants to think about what they need to do every step along the way so that we can make sure that they finish everything, kind of on time, let's say. So those are a couple things. Okay, well, thank you everyone. Really appreciate you joining and look forward to meeting you all soon.